take off your coats, feel comfortable. How many other different ways there are of saying this, I'm not sure, but I try different ways each week. Do some stretches while the numbers go up. The numbers are rising. The numbers are rising. This is good. They're beginning to settle out. And I think we're going to make a start. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this special bonus episode of It's Bloody Complicated. I'm your host here, Frances Foley, Deputy Director at Compass. And for those of you who are new to the podcast format, welcome. Very much welcome to the Compass podcast. The way we usually run these calls is that we want to hear from you. So we invite you all on the call as a live Q&A session. And the format will be that I'll ask our amazing panel of experts today some questions. Today's focus, unsurprisingly, will be about the US midterms and US politics in general. And then it will come to you guys. So already, if you have burning questions, if there are things you really, really want to know about US politics, if you don't understand what red wave means, please stick it in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And you can see other people's questions there. You can upvote them. You can't downvote them because Zoom doesn't like that. But please also introduce yourself in the chat. We always ask people to come on and introduce themselves, say where you're listening from, say what you're interested in, say why you joined here tonight. Tonight's episode will probably go on very slightly longer than the 7 o'clock time we usually finish. And that's just because we have an amazing panel and I want to give them enough time to both be interrogated by me and interrogated by you. So it's very possible that we might run till 10 past 7, but we will definitely finish before 15:15 because these guys are in the States in the middle of their working day. So we want to make sure that they get back to the amazing work that they are always doing. So I think that's probably enough of the housekeeping for now. Oh, the final thing to say is that this episode is being recorded. It will go out as a podcast. So be aware that when you come on to ask your question, you will be preserved in all of time on the Compass podcast later on. So without further ado, I'm really excited to welcome our panelists here tonight and really appreciative that they've all taken time out. We were just talking before about how everybody is pretty much run into the ground and completely exhausted from their amazing efforts the last few weeks, months, and let's be honest, years. We're here tonight because last week, as no one will have failed to notice, we had the US midterms. It's a halfway point for the presidency, for the Democrats this time around. And it's a highly significant test for the incumbents, but it also sets the context for the next 2 years of the legislative agenda. And this year, for those of you who are following, might already know that the widely predicted Republican return, the red wave, which had been touted across the board really, failed to kind of materialize. And Democrats might well be feeling relieved, some of them even optimistic or hopeful about the electoral wins that they scored. Some very high profile candidates actually won their races, which would cause a massive celebration. And they might well be thinking about the legislative prospects for the next 2 years. But I've been very much warned by everybody I know in the States to not take anything for granted, which I think the legacy of the past few years. Democracy was apparently on the ballot at this election, according to Joe Biden and a bunch of prominent Democrats, and fundamental rights, as we all know, still hang in the balance. So everything is very precarious. But to help us understand what's happened and what implications it might have for US and indeed global politics in the years ahead, I'm delighted to welcome Sky Gallegos, Frank Sherry, and Ashley McBride to the podcast this evening. So I'll let you guys properly say what you do, but I just wanted to say that all three have an amazing array of experience and expertise, which covers campaigning, communications, on-the-ground organizing, strategy, and are also just lovely people. So I'm really excited for each all of us to have joined us tonight. We start in the normal Compass fashion, which is that we go around and basically just put you on the spot and say, how are you? Firstly, where are you? And secondly, how are you? And maybe give a reference to how the last week has been for you. Let's start with Sky and then go Ashley, Frank.
Hello. I am now located on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in the United States. So down in the far, deep, red South. Loving it here, though. It's a beautiful town. I'm doing good. I'm really just happy, relieved, and optimistic might be too much of a stretch for 24 at this point. But I am relieved and happy, and every day uncovering another nugget of what we did well last week. So I'm good.
That's great. Good to hear. How about you, Ashley? Where are you and how are you doing?
Thank you, Francis. Doing well. I am actually in Camp Springs, Maryland right now. I would say echo some of the sentiments of Sky. I am feeling relieved, but there's still a level of anxiety as we are watching some things unfold around the country. But overall, very pleased with the outcome of Tuesday's election. So I'm trying to get some rest in between catching up on some good shows.
Oh, excellent. I'm glad to hear that you have got some leisure time lined up. Actually, that is very well deserved. Frank, how are you doing and whereabouts are you?
I'm doing good. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And I have to say, I was sort of sharpening all of my analysis about how stupid Americans are and how they care more about petrol prices than democracy. But I have to revise it now and say, yay, America. You know, the good guys seem to pull it out a bit, and it's far from over, as my colleagues are saying. But this was a really welcome surprise.
That's great. A little bit of faith in democracy restored. I heard a great commentator on the radio saying that she'd been deprived of her favorite election day activity, which was hating on Americans. And I thought, oh Lord, we need much less of that. I mean, across all countries, right? But yes, it's a relief and a heavy dose of optimism and good faith, I think. So to start with the question of kind of what y'all have been doing the last few weeks, months, I really wanted to ask you, what have you been doing in the election, apart from maybe refreshing, especially over the last week or so, to just update on the results. But over the previous months and weeks, I wanted to give you a chance to say the amazing work that you guys have been doing across the board on different things. We'll start with you, Ashley, because you've been right there in amongst it on the ground. Can you tell us what you've been working on the last few weeks, months?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. So in Pennsylvania, I've been doing work in Pennsylvania now for about 12 years. One of the things that's really important is that in Pennsylvania, we don't have same-day voter registration, while there are other states who enjoy that. Our registration period is really kind of the focal point to make sure that we're registering as many voters as possible. So I oversaw a C4 voter registration program, which allowed us to have an opportunity to talk to people, to potential voters, not just about what it means to turn out, but to actually be able to talk about our candidates and our issues that are on the ballot. So started really the early part of the year doing that, focused on that, partnering with organizations to make sure that we were registering as many voters as possible. And then it moved into more of electoral work, where we were knocking on doors, we were making phone calls, we were sending text messages to every registered voter to make sure that they are turning out, that they know the importance. One of the things that we do, particularly in our work, is making sure that we're not just going in, we're not transactional, we're not just showing up to say that someone should care about a specific candidate or an issue, but really talking to them and being able to connect them with our candidates and issues. So we ended this cycle knocking over 700,000 doors, making nearly 1 million calls and over 1 million texts to voters across the Commonwealth to really make sure that we engage them and we were talking about the issues that matter, but really connecting them with those candidates on the ballot so that they could do that research themselves, and essentially making sure that they turned out on election day or in the weeks prior, using our no excuse vote by mail.
That's amazing. And just the numbers there, they roll off the tongue quickly, but I just want to say just the amount of effort and all of the infrastructure that goes into like making that happen, I just think is kind of awe-inspiring, especially for us in the UK, where I still think we're pretty bad at voter registration. Frank, what have you been doing during the election? Let us know. How have you been spending the last few months?
Yeah, I have the easy job. Ashley and Sky have to get voters to the polls. We work in political communications, but it's been the run up to the election was dominated by a bunch of pundits saying that this is about inflation and crime and immigration, and Republicans going to have a red wave, and oh, by the way, Latino voters are becoming Republican, and it was like this pack journalism thing that was just so annoying. And we were fighting back about it. No, talk about democracy, talk about abortion, talk about extremism. Anyway, we ended up, not because of us, but because of the voters who are the real protagonists in this. But we were vindicated. Joe Biden was right to talk about abortion and democracy, and candidates were right to point out how extremist these Trumpian acolytes were, and then Latinos didn't become Republican, except in South Florida, which is a special case. In any case, we came out like, wow, we were right and you were wrong. It's not always easy to say that to the media because they never admit that they're wrong, and they're never held accountable because they're the ones who hold people accountable. But our Twitter game is really strong.
That's excellent to hear. And I have a juicy question coming up on exactly that thing very soon. Sky, tell us I know that you've been doing a million different things from the various levels of like energetic / frenzied emails that I've received from you, mostly ignoring all points of grammar and capital letters. And I'm like, I can't even believe that Sky's writing emails right now. You tell us what you've been doing.
I've had the pleasure of managing an organization, and working with Ashley. Managing an organization that runs direct voter contact, so field programs across 5 states, 5 battleground states, 4.5 because Florida didn't really count this cycle, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada. Which has just been, we did great in all of our states, and Ashley's numbers rolled right off her tongue, but I can't give you across all of I think we're about over almost 2 million total voter contacts, that's just door knocks across our states. So then in my spare time, I worked with just a immigration group that Frank knows well, America's Voice, and helping to think about how we fight the disinformation campaign that Republicans continuously put out about immigrants, immigration, refugees, etc., which was challenging this year, to say the least. And also worked a little bit with some red states in trying to help develop more democratic infrastructure. In particular, Tennessee, we had high hopes that possibly we could also get rid of some election deniers and extremists. We came a little closer than we have before, but we still need more money and time put into some of these southern states to turn the tide down here. So
yeah, we're amidst everything else, and continuing to function as a human being and raise your son, and all of the other things.
Right.
No, that's incredible. And I think for us in the UK, as I say, and I'll say again and again, like, these numbers are huge and sort of mind-boggling. But a lot of work goes into thinking about the way that the different parts of the operations fit together, and maybe we'll come to that in a second. But I wanted to pick up on something that Frank actually has already touched on, which is, I, have had a bit of a bee in my bonnet over the last few years, particularly about this media question. I mean, there's been a lot of hype over the past even decade about the question about polling, how that affects people's voting behavior, and holding pollsters to account. But I think just as important, as you say, is the media and how they set the whole backdrop for an election. And oftentimes when they are proved wrong, they don't get held accountable for it. And we also don't reflect, maybe as political organizers and operatives, like why that was. So I wanted to ask each of you why you believe that the Democrats were underestimated at these elections. And I think it's interesting because I think this is a story that's also international. I think if you look around the world at many elections over the past few years, I'm thinking about German elections, which I followed quite closely. I'm also thinking about Australian elections, even Brazilian elections. There was a lot of like downplaying of progressives' chances. And whilst all of us remember bitterly the last decade of losses, especially I would say 2016 for you guys, 2015 for us, which was like the moment that hope got you, and that was crushed out of me, and I've been a cynic ever since. So all of us, have remembered these and have these bruises, but I also think it's worth reflecting on times where that didn't come true and you feel a sense of relief or optimism. So let's start with you, Frank, because you raised it, and then I'm going to come to Ashley and Sky as well.
Well, there is a historical record that no president in Biden's situation has every time when it's like all the swing voters after the first 2 years of a new president swing against the party in power. They're not happy with the way things are. And so this was the most extraordinary election since 1934, that there was results that were the Democrats, the party in power, will pick up a Senate seat, and once they win Georgia, which I'm confident they will, and held losses to less than 10 House seats. So, sagging approval numbers for Biden, history, high inflation. So that was what was sort of feeding a lot of it. The other thing that happened, just interestingly, is that there's all these poll aggregators that try to project what's going to happen with these sophisticated models. Republicans tried to game the system. They flooded the zone with junk polls that skewed the numbers. So there's a sort of a right-leaning aggregator called Real Clear Politics that a lot of political professionals used to use. They said that the Democrats were going to lose, 35, 40 House seats and 8 Senate seats. They were so wrong because they were flooded in a deliberate attempt by right-wing operatives to try to get turnout by Democrats to collapse. It was so we're so polarized that even the aggregators are being targeted by operatives. But the good news is that young people turned out, women turned out, Latinos, African Americans, and Asians turned out, educated, like all the people that the right-wing others turned out in ways that all the polling is based on estimates of who's going to turn out. They make that shit up. They just do. They don't know who's going to turn out, right? So it's like, okay, well, we have margins, we have history, and it's like, yeah, but you say who's going to turn out when nobody knows. And so there's this incredible, I'll just stop with this. There was a byplay of there was some Democratic operatives on Twitter saying, wait a minute, the early vote, the people who show up and drop off ballots or send them in, was incredibly high for Democrats. That's a big deal. And the pundits were saying, oh, no, that doesn't matter. Well, it turned out that it mattered a lot because the turnout operations that Sky and Ashley and many others were driving banked the early vote so that then their turnout operations could focus on the lower propensity voters. And so the turnout operations on the ground really, I think, made a huge difference. And the fact that a lot of people said, this wasn't a referendum on Biden. This was a choice election between sort of boring Democrats and crazy Republicans. And so the crazy became much more of a factor than, Joe Biden's doddering style. That doddering style seemed to play really well when Trump and his acolytes were, taking AR-15s to their ads and trying to show how tough they were and how they were going to own the libs. So it defied history.
That's amazing to hear. And I think the point about that is also this question of don't allow, if you want to talk about any sort of political elites, not just the politicians and the campaigners and the pollsters, it's also the media who then, try to take this election out of the hands of voters by saying, actually downplaying voters' agency in this, which is actually, as you say, is, you can show up, you can cross the ballot, and that will make a difference. So don't let them tell you that all of the stats, it feels overwhelming. And as a citizen, what we have is still our vote, and we can still go and do that. How did you, think about this, Ashley, in the few months coming up to it, and especially given all of the doors you were knocking on, what were your organizers telling people and trying to get them out, galvanize and make sure that they know that this actually matters?
I think Frank said something earlier, and he talked about having the easier job on the messaging piece, but actually that is the most challenging piece for us, is really to make sure that we are effectively messaging to voters. One of the things I think a lot of times is that media pollsters, so many people try to divide us, or as you said, really take away agency from the voter. The reality is that when we talk to working, because again, our organization focused on connecting with working families, working communities, and really lifting up the issues that matter most in their values. And so again, we didn't go to the door and say, hey, my first conversation wasn't that you should just vote for Josh Shapiro or John Fetterman, which were our candidates, and we're happy for that pickup in Pennsylvania. We are the only pickup in the Senate right now. And so certainly excited about that. But the reality is these voters care about the same things that every other voter cares about, and being able to talk to them and really point back, looking at the administration, whether we talk about what this meant to Biden or on democracy. I think this really was about democracy, because some of those issues when we talked about abortion, the reality is that every voter we talked about, it might not have been their number one issue, but they realized what was at stake, and we set out on this election. There were so many people who were a little bit just again, saying that, look, politicians, they don't care. These elected officials don't care. But the reality is that there was just way too much on the ballot for us to take that chance. And so again, being able to connect the issues that they care about with the candidates and really looking at what this administration has done, the Biden administration has done to make it easier for working families, for families across really the entire country to survive in what we've seen as an unprecedented pandemic. The reality is that I can talk in big words about what it means, but breaking it down to say, look, when we talk about having access to affordable and quality healthcare, something that so many Americans still struggle, even with all of the provisions that have been put in place, but we see that the Republican Party continues to fight against, to make it harder, to make the cost of insulin unbearable or really unaffordable, that people are still making the decision about whether they purchase groceries or their medicine, which just seems so inhumane. When we talk about access to an educational system, whether we're talking about primary and secondary or higher education, that is in reach for everyone who wants to have that opportunity, that people want their children to go to a school that is safe, that provides an education for them. So working together and making sure that we're having those conversations really was the difference breaker. People realize that at the end of the day, many of the things that Democrats have been really challenged on or called to the carpet to say that they haven't been able to deliver, it is not by virtue of them not trying. It is we have been faced with an opposition like none other. I am really looking for and just saying, hey, well, sensible Republicans, please stand up, come back. I think we could get with them all day, every day, but some of these other folks, and I think really what we saw in many of these places where there were election deniers, people who had been on the record of being involved in the January 6th, were really the ones that people said, like, there's no way. These are not people that we want to lead. This is not a reflection of what our democracy is by any way, shape, or form. And they voted for candidates who did align with their values, who we could point back and say, a Josh Shapiro, he didn't just become attorney general and start working for the people. He had been that's what he had done his entire career. And even in the arguments that we heard in state against John Fetterman, the reality is that he had stood up. He had done all those things from the time he was a mayor to a lieutenant governor to running for U.S. Senate. And so again, I think messaging is so important, but also being in a place that we don't just talk at voters, but we really listen to, and again, connect the issues that they care with the candidates on the ballot. And sometimes it is a matter of saying, like, yes, this is a matter of saying, like, we will not sit this thing out. And we can see that these candidates care about our issues, our families, and not just for today, but for our entire future.
Yeah, 100%. Sky, I wanted to pick up on that question that actually I also just touched on, which is this question of also how you kind of balance the sort of positive message and especially kind of owning the legislative wins that like Biden and this administration have had over the last couple of years and talking about those. I know that's been a big question about communications. How do we talk about, lifting this many children out of poverty? How do we talk about like action on climate? How do we talk about like boosts of jobs? Plus this question of also pointing to the other side, as Frank also touched on, and saying, these guys are mental and they're coming to take your like fundamental human rights away. I just think that's a difficult question, but how do you see that reflected, and also the fact that maybe the Democrats did better than expected?
Well, I do think that, I was thinking about this question a little bit more. President Biden and his administration had some significant accomplishments in the first 2 years. But they're difficult ones to message on. I mean, to talk about infrastructure and spending on infrastructure can be difficult. Even talking about why the economy is the way it is right now is difficult. We all know that. You know it just as well as we do in the UK, that this is complicated, and there are multiple levers around the world that have been pulled to get us all to the place that we are with inflation. So it was a complicated, the economy can be very complicated to message on. And also in traditional, as usual, the legislative wins that we had take some time to kick in, right? So it isn't the kind of thing that people are going to feel tomorrow in their pocketbook. I think somebody on the television the other day said, we didn't get to just send out a check with his signature on it. We actually did real important things that are going to have long-term impact on people's bank accounts, but that's difficult to message on. So I think that, could we have done a better job of messaging proactively about our wins? Sure, we certainly could have. I think it was we were in a tough spot on that front, and we could probably have done better. But it turns out making sure that people understood how bad, like how much the woman or man on the other side of the aisle was, and how much they didn't align with your basic values and your basic humanity, worked. So we in this instance, I really feel like in so many cases, Americans showed up to vote with their heart. They knew sensibly that this person doesn't make sense to be in office for us. They don't reflect our values as a country, and they don't reflect my values as a person. And that's what happened. And I think that's also a reason why we saw some, it's a complicated election. The results are varied across. You have some great governors who lost because in those cases, people did hold them accountable for either inflation or the economy or COVID restrictions. But then you had, other Democrats who probably didn't, have as much name ID, like Katie Hobbs just called last night in Arizona, win, without a record on it. But people felt that she was better and somebody you should put your trust in than Carrie Lake.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to say this as simple as that. You've got, you do have this choice, and we can talk about the wider issues, but this is the choice that you have today. So I wanted to dig into this just a little bit of this question of the operations and how they link to these strategic and communications strategies. So I'm particularly going to ask Ashley and Sky this one as well about, have you seen at this election there be some kind of sort of experimentation or innovation in terms of like the field operations that are going out? What have you seen that's been particularly effective? I mean, I know you talked, Ashley, about kind of just the actual sheer numbers and making those operations work as a huge effort. But have you seen there in other places, maybe in campaigns you've been involved with, but maybe also from other colleagues across the country, things that have been really working in terms of making sure that there's a link between the strategy and the oversight and the communications right down to turning out voters on election day, as we heard. That's basically what they're on the midterms, right?
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that we do uniquely well here is that we work in many of our states, we work together collaboratively. There are tables that exist. And really the important thing that we do For Our Future particularly is making sure that there is layered communication, that we're not just trying to have a conversation one time with a voter, but that we're really building a relationship, that we're identifying what issues move them, what they care about, and we continue to have conversations around those things that they care about. Instead of me showing up to a door, for instance, and saying, look, let's talk about climate when education is the thing that matters most to you. And I'm not saying it's wasting my time, but if education is what you value and what will move you to go and do the thing that I need you to do, I'm going to have that conversation in a very real way about education with you. And again, making sure that I'm connecting it with my candidates that I want to get elected. I think that particularly For Our Future, we have made sure that, again, that we're having this conversation multiple times. And for many of these voters, we have now been talking to them since 2016, the inception of For Our Future. So again, when somebody sees me, I become a trusted messenger. When people show up at a door with a t-shirt on or a name badge and we're representing For Our Future, people trust us. We've been in the community. We're not just showing up. We're not just transactional saying, hey, come vote for us. We've done events. We've come together to fight for the things that a community cares for. We also are looking to really amplify those voices and to support those to lift their voices, including those who will, because of an interaction with one of our members of our organization, will decide to run for office. And so again, layered communication is so important. So when we think about it strategically, yes, we want to knock on a door. And in what I have found, and really many of the partners, one of the most effective ways of communicating with the voter is by knocking on the door and having that in-person conversation. During COVID, so many things we had to kind of revisit and think through what we were going to do to make sure that our staff were safe, but also that voters were safe. And so there was less door knocking in 2020. But again, that is really one of the things that really I feel like moves people, but also making sure that they get the text message, that they get the phone calls, that they're seeing the ads that are on that other partners are doing, or if it is mail. So again, by the time we go to knock on the door, they've been hit so many times, whether they're listening to this on a radio station or a podcast, that the message is consistent. And I think that we did a really great job in Pennsylvania specifically, and so many other states did a really great job in making sure that the messaging was consistent. And even if that messaging for some people was like, look, we cannot let democracy be defeated, people showed up and I think really surprised our entire nation.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was Alistair Campbell or Peter Mandelson, some of the gurus of New Labour politics, who said you have to say something 5 times before people before it goes in. This is what my boss always says about the fact that I always bring him up on the fact that he repeats the same lies over and over. We have a bit of a bingo session going on there. But he was like, I have to say it 5 times. I was like, yeah, I got it.
But not only does it help us with that voter, we do something oftentimes in our organization called vote tripling. So I'm not just asking you to show up for yourself, but I'm asking you to make sure that you take your family, your friends, your neighbors, that you're having this conversation. And when you hear the message so often, it is easy for that person to also repeat that message. Or they're a soundboard, then they become an echo chamber for the messaging that we have to connect with all of our voters to make sure that they're doing the thing that we need them to do.
Yeah, that's so true though, isn't it? Because if it also I think that combats this feeling of also alienation, to that point about what does it matter if I vote? Well, it's like, it's not just you, go and pick up your grandparents, tell your friends, tell your, just ring people around and get them out, basically. And I think that gives people a role in the election when it's not just about, well, what does a little old me do? I mean, for me personally, it's stickers and merch. I'll vote for anyone if you give me stickers and merch. I don't care who it is. Give me a sticker. You guys are much better at that than we are over here.
You talked about agency. And so again, really supporting that and encouraging it. Look, you have agency over your vote, and that you have really you can make the difference here. I think the reality is that we hear that message all the time. What does my vote count? And we're seeing in places where there are elections that are really decided by less than 15 votes, or that there are places where again a runoff is pushed because of a certain number of votes. And so absolutely every vote counts, particularly your vote counts.
Yeah, and Sky, I wanted to come to you then on this question. Anything that's particularly sparked your interest? Any new, interesting, funny things? The only thing that I will add is just I loved watching Joy to the Polls. I will love watching them every election, and I love watching them this year. And I was like, I'm not sure if that would ever work in the UK because it's so bloody miserable. But for the people who don't know, Joy to the Polls do these amazing, basically open air gigs, get a DJ set down, get some people dancing outside the polls, and make polls a really sort of voting a really celebratory, fun, interesting experience. And I was like, would that work here? Well, there's only one way of finding out, but we're going to hire a minibus and get DJ decks down. So Sky, yeah, what actually worked?
We have been doing some version of that for as long as I've been in politics. We just didn't have the video capability of capturing it and letting everybody see it. But now, and I don't work as close to the ground as Ashley does, so I couldn't point to specific things like that. And unfortunately, I have to spend more time worrying about payroll and insurance and things like that. But I will say that I think something that, in listening to Ashley too, I think that we have gotten, so all these races were close. We all knew it was going to come down to field and actually talking to voters directly, not through paid advertising. And I think we find through the silver lining of COVID is that we actually got much better at meeting voters where they are, finding them where they are, talking to them where they are. And, Ashley talked about layering communications. And I think that we've just gotten so much better at being creative and using all different mediums and really, maybe not just 5 times, but 50 times reinforcing messages or themes in coming at voters in all the myriad of ways that they take in information. So I do think, I think that we knocked lots of doors, no doubt, but we also did a really good job, I think, of layering program in a creative 360 way.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that sort of thing was something, as you say, is a legacy of COVID, which is interesting in terms of innovation. So I want to ask a couple more questions, and then we've got some juicy questions coming along in the question and answer. So I'm going to get to those very shortly. So this is a question for you, Frank. I kind of touched on it earlier, but it's this question about the sort of solid policy achievements that Biden and his colleagues have had over the last 2 years. And in fact, I would say, once again, back to expectation setting in the media, but that he actually maybe has outperformed on some of the things he managed to get through. So the IRA bill and some of the pandemic response, which maybe he didn't expect. And obviously that was a bit very touch and go, given Joe Manchin and all of those other kind of holding people ransomed with these sorts of things. So they're very kind of brittle. But I've heard in some places where I was reading some commentary that maybe what Biden and his administration just needed to do was kind of double down on talking about the things they have actually achieved. Also, instead of always promising to the future and pledging support, saying to people, as Ashley was talking to, you know, actually, we did this. This means that X, Y, Z. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Yeah, I mean, Sky's right that it's really hard to communicate the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Adjustment Act and its 17 provisions in a way that works with voters who have busy lives and don't pay attention to politics the way we all do. So it is hard, but I do think that some issues really broke through, and I think the basic competence of Democrats broke through. The idea that even with Republicans saying no to everything, they found ways to get things done. You know, an infrastructure package that's been talked about for 30 years in America, and they finally passed one. You know, for young people, the idea of a climate change, you know, bill and student loan forgiveness and a gun violence bill, we're kind of like, wow, these people actually can do things, because they don't understand how, as Ashley was saying, Republican opposition is on, you know, let's stop them from doing anything so we can say that they suck like everybody else, right? So it's been part of the Republican war on government as a collective enterprise since Ronald Reagan, and it's been amazingly effective. The idea that Democrats finally had the majority, even though it was slim, and got things done, even if they didn't really know what it was, it did break through. It did break through quite a bit. The fact that the economy's strong, yeah, inflation's up. But, you know, at least most people know that it's higher in Britain than it is in America. And sorry, couldn't resist.
We're not having you back.
You know, and there was something about a war in Ukraine that, you know, maybe had something to do with it. But the other thing is, it's not either or. The fact that the Supreme Court, packed by Trump and the Republicans, took away a fundamental right for half the population that had been in place for 50 years with its anti-abortion. I mean, like, you don't have to be politically savvy to understand what that's about. And so that really did break through, and it corresponded to the craziness of all these Republicans saying that the 2020 election was fraudulent and rigged and Trump was robbed. It's like, there's no evidence of it. Only in crazy right-wing circles is that a thing. But like in Pennsylvania, where Ashley was working, the gubernatorial candidate and the senatorial candidate were running on that shit, right? And so it's like, you know, Doug Mastriano is this like Christo-fascist, you know, he was at the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, and he was running for governor, nominated by Republicans of Pennsylvania, or this wacko Carrie Lake or Blake Masters in Arizona, a state that we followed very closely. And they look like, I mean, they were just so arrogant. I mean, it was really symbolized when Nancy Pelosi, who we all love, the head of the House of Representatives, Democrat, and her husband was hit over the head with a hammer by a right-wing terrorist, and the Republicans made fun of it. And it was like, oh my God, these people are so in their own world that they don't think they'll ever be held accountable. And it was almost like so a lot of people turned out, women, people of color, young people, etc. But like a fairly big chunk of independents and even Republicans said, wow, those people are out of bounds. We can't vote for them. Something like 10% of Republicans voted for Democrats. In a tough year like this, normally it's about 2-1 independents voting for the out party. It was 50-50. So not only was there mobilization of groups that don't always turn out, if you will, on the left, in the middle, there was a tremendous revulsion to the extremism and the kind of violent rhetoric and violent actions. I mean, we work on immigration. The Republican message was, we are being invaded, as if it was a military operation, and they're trying to replace white people. I mean, that is some sorry white nationalist fascist shit, right? And that was like the mainstream Republican message. And they thought it was going to work with all these independents and soft Republicans. And the independents and soft Republicans are like, you're doing away with abortion, you don't believe in democracy, and you're putting a target on the back of brown and black people? No. So it was really a comeuppance for the Republican arrogance in the Trump era. It's far from over, but boy, it's a lot better than the alternative.
So I've managed to sort of avoid talking about Republicans all the way through. It hasn't been entirely intentional, but that's because I noticed that there were some juicy questions coming out that in the chat, in the Q&A. So we have some lots unloaded for the next stage. Sky, I have a question then for all of you. Finally, my final question is kind of a little bit this looking ahead to the next 2 years. What do you think the results, just not necessarily any predictions, but kind of what do you think the results enable, or what should they enable for Biden and the Democrats in terms of policy priorities to kind of focus on? But also I wanted to kind of layer this question with a bit this idea of compromise about the kind of urgency and the precarity of 2024, and this question of like what needs doing in America and the world. And so obviously that's a question that every politician has to look at and think, how do I win votes? And also, how do I act on the most pressing issues at the time? Now, of course, there's a huge overlap of that. And you think, talking about all the things we've talked about tonight, whether it be healthcare or democratic rights or climate or jobs or justice, like all of these things are huge. And you think we want that to translate through to voters, and we want the voters to turn out because they see us acting on those things. Hence my question to Frank. But you also have to think a little bit about, am I also gonna, I have to defend myself against these massive attacks from Republicans, and I'm like in a very real legislative way, but also in a communications way, going to have to double down on some things that maybe I didn't want to double down on, or be less bold than I think I should be on some of these agendas. How do you see that playing out in the next couple of years, and what do you hope that they do, not just what you think they will do?
Well, I actually think we've been, I think in these last several months, we're pretty bold. Talking about abortion at the way that the president has and did was, I don't recall a president doing. We're obviously in unique times with our fundamental right to choose being stripped from us by the Supreme Court, but still, that was bold. Eliminating student debt, that was bold. So I actually think now that we voters rejected, these extremist candidates, we have the mandate. I think we have the ability now to put some real good ideas forward, some bold ideas forward, and hold the Republicans accountable to continue to do what they've been doing and just didn't get called on it enough, which is just playing politics with people's lives. All they do is play politics and block votes because they think that's going to give them some edge later, not because it actually will or will not help a voter and in their everyday life. And I actually think, I really would love to hear my colleagues speak to this too, but I really do think we have an opportunity in the next 2 years to make some statements. Now, will much get passed? Probably not, because that's just the way divided government works here, unfortunately. But I think we have an ability to make some statements about what we are for, to speak to some of the questions in Q&A about also positive messaging. We now have a chance to talk about what we are for, what we want to see happen, how we want to solve problems, including, I would be remiss not to say, immigration. And hold Republicans accountable for not making it happen.
Absolutely. And how do you see this, Ashley, in terms of that kind of interplay of how you weave in some things which really need to get done in the next couple of years, but also have an eye on 2024 in the election?
I think, we're thinking about this all the time. For instance, we were talking the other day, and I was just saying I still have some PTSD from 2016. Again, going into 2016, there's no way you would have told me that Donald Trump was going to be president. And 44,292 votes is what separated a win from a defeat there. And so I'm always optimistic, but I think Sky is right. Like, look, we can't be afraid to really call them out for what it is that they're doing. And again, it's not just a matter of going against Democrats. They really are adamantly doing a disservice to those who elected them as leaders. The reality is that many of the policies that we've seen put forth, much of the legislation that has come forth, are things that would help people across the country. And what my grandmother used to say is, don't cut off your nose in spite of your face. And I feel like Republicans do that all the time. The reality is that there are lots of people who are hurting, who need these things. And it is our responsibility, again, to call them out for just what it is. So as you were saying, like, you know, when we're having these conversations with voters and people can't point to the things that Democrats have done in a positive way, that is on us. We have to do better about communicating that, but we also have to do better about really calling the other side out for what it is. I think that we continue to have these conversations. I think one of the things, and we didn't really talk about this, a lot of times in US politics, we do a lot of great things, but a lot of times the money that allows us to do this comes so late, so it makes it so much harder. So there's always appeal to those who fund this type of work to make sure that there's an investment earlier so that we can do something year round. One of the beauties of For Our Future are that we don't just show up at elections, we have a year round operation, which allows us to talk to voters much sooner, much more often, and be a part of really kind of the ongoing conversation in communities across the country. And so that is something that is needed. We hope that those who, again, invest in this work don't take this as just something that we're patting ourselves on the back or we're taking for granted, that 2024 will go in a positive way. I am very much optimistic, but I know that we have lots of work to do.
Definitely. And the fact that you have that number of the exact number of votes like tattooed on your brain is maybe akin to me, us at Compass being like, there was 62 progressive tragedies at the last election. I know where all of them are. It's where the progressive vote was higher than the conservative vote and they still lost this. You know, we have these numbers, they go around my head and maybe that's why I can't sleep. Frank, what do you, I'm not asking you for predictions here. I'm asking you for, well, maybe some predictions, but that's a fool's game in politics. So well, yeah, I mean, go ahead.
First of all, I want Ashley to run for office someday. So that's
yes. We'd
and the fact that our democracy rests on her shoulders is really good news for those of us.
I was about to say you've got one vote here, but obviously Ashley can't vote.
Well,
so I'll volunteer on the campaign.
I mean, Ashley's figured it out in Pennsylvania.
Francis, you got to watch out because they'll have a campaign against you. It'll be like, look, Francis was over here trying to vote.
Foreign interference in our elections. Forget about the Russians. It's this one British girl.
So this is what I want to say is that this election isn't like, this is just another battle in, as we say in Spanish, una guerra prolongada. This is a long war between the forces of authoritarian populism, also known as fascism, and multiracial egalitarian democracy, right? And so we're seeing it. You guys live it. We all. It's all over the place, right? So what encourages us is that the Democrats have figured out, because Democrats have a different coalition than Republicans. Republicans have a racially, religiously, and ideologically unified party for the most part, right? A bunch of white Christians who want men to dominate, and they'll take women and people of color who support that view. It's really a retro, like we're going to go back to the way it was when white men were on top and all you others, all you uppity others have to get back in your place. And what's happened is that, and then the Democratic coalition is much more diverse and difficult, and it's, suburban, non-university educated women who vote different parties all the time, and progressive activists who are like, this party is brain dead and corporatist and we need to change it. What Democrats, I think, are figuring out is that you have to be both and as a Democrat. You have to speak to the middle about solutions and competence, and that I'm open to working with anybody, and speaking to the base in a way that it's not duplicitous, it's coherent. And that you have a ground operation to really speak to those groups. And so while Democrats have the tougher case, we've gotten better at it. We've gotten better at turnout and persuasion, or what do you call it now? Mobilization or something. So the idea is, and then the Republicans, which seem so united behind this Trumpian banner of semi-fascism, are falling apart. I mentioned to you, Francis, it's like, we're like past the popcorn. Here comes the red wedding. I mean, here they go, right? Trump is going to announce for president, and like the donor class and the Murdoch-controlled right-wing media all want to like knife him in the back. But he controls about 50% of the Republican base voter. And so my hope Literally, because you got to burn the shit to the ground. You cannot like have a reformed Republican Party with a Trump acolyte who's a little bit more, normal. See Ron DeSantis of Florida. No, what we want is for Trump to literally say it's my way or the highway. And then if he does get defeated by the forces that are organizing against him, that he walks and he splits the party. And therefore they go to defeat for like a generation so that we can actually have the kind of, I saw somebody ask about the process reform, so that we can have like a democracy that's updated and fair that we don't have now. And then we can have policies that reflect majority opinion, which we don't have now. So we're, I just hope I live to see it, but I'm hopeful that Democrats are getting better at uniting their fractious coalition and Republicans are getting into a circular firing squad, and I'm here for it.
We're all here for that. God. Okay, I'm going to come to some questions. We've got some great questions coming up for you. So first up is Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello. I think it might be just a point of clarification, really. Frank, you talked about, when you were talking about the Latino vote, you said Florida was a special case. Could you explain that, please?
We will take 3 questions at once, just for time purposes. Brian, we're going to come to you for your question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. So I remember when Roe versus Wade first came in, and there was a lot of speculation that the Republicans had gone one step too far and there'd be a massive backlash against it. And then it all went quiet on that front, and then it seemed to go back to sort of politics as usual. And so I picked up this article from Michael Moore in The Guardian yesterday, which is one of our newspapers, and he basically says, there's so much negativity, sort of fighting in the trenches going on, that actually it depresses the vote. So he was basically saying he called it right. That he predicted that there wouldn't be a Republican landslide, which other people were fearing, and he's also talking about the negative messaging that's coming out because people are afraid that Ron DeSantis will be like Trump but with a brain. So I don't know. I'm not close enough to the way the actual campaigning takes place on the ground in the US. Does Michael Moore have a point? What do you guys think?
Interesting question, Brian. I actually saw that piece as well, and I was interested by that. I'd be really interested in the panel's views. And we have one more question from Maggie. Maggie, go ahead and ask a question.
Hello. Yes, new legislation in the UK will require voter ID, but this is restricted to things like driver's license, passport, or elder person's bus pass. This discriminates against young people who don't have these, and it seems it's deliberate, deliberately undemocratic.
Absolutely.
So do voters in the US have to show ID, and is this deliberately restricted to deny some sectors of society their democratic right to vote?
Brilliant. Thank you, Maggie. I think the short answer to that is an overwhelming yes, in capital letters with many exclamation marks underlined in italics. But we will get a more nuanced view of that from the panel. So any questions you want to bring up from that round, guys? We'll start with Sky, then we'll go Ashley and Frank. And you don't have to pick up every question, but just go for the ones that you most were excited about.
I'm going to let Frank talk about Latino vote in Florida, so I won't go there. I saw that question about Michael Moore and a positive message, and DeSantis all kind of rolled into one in the Q&A. So I was thinking about, and also I saw a couple other comments about what I was talking about earlier in how Americans made their choice. I think that, yes, it feels like there was more of that could feel like we were doing more fear mongering or focusing on the negative, but I really do still see it as like just presenting the facts of what was on the ballot, as opposed to negative messaging. And I do think, now that we've kind of dealt with that a little bit, and hopefully we don't have those, maybe the Republicans learn their lesson and don't put those same kind of folks on the ticket next time. We can actually, talk more about what we're for and what we want to do and how we want to make lives better. Because I do think this time around it was necessary because I really do think our democracy was at stake, obviously, with some of these candidates. So that's one thing. On DeSantis, I was also just ruminating about that. I've heard the same thing. And yes, that it is, it's easy to feel a little scared or threatened by his potential candidacy, because presumably he's maybe more strategic or well-informed than Trump and how he runs. I don't think, though, I think we have there's no reason for us to run scared. I agree with Michael Moore in that sense. We should not be talking about, oh gosh, it's just going to be bad because he's going to come along. If you think DeSantis, he has this interesting combination. He's a bully, just like Trump was a bully. He's a huge bully, and that's going to come out. Like he can't even hide it when he's talking or how he acts. So people will see that when he's on the trail for sure. He also is for all his pandering to the Latino vote in South Florida, he would rather go back to the way things were when white men were on top. And I think people will see that as we go along. And also, he's not likable. If you think about who was the last Republican that really maintained power, was George Bush. And George Bush was, whether you wanted him to be your president or not, he was kind of a likable guy. So I mean, is it going to be easy? No, it's all, presidential campaigns are never easy. And one last thing I want to point out here, Frank was talking about models that are flawed because we tend to focus on history and have that inform our numbers and think that that's, God's truth right there. We have to stop doing that. If anything, the last 3 cycles have shown us that one cycle is not like the next cycle. One election is not like the next election. We have no idea what it's going to be like the next time around. And I just don't think that we can base the future on the past when it comes to prognosticating or even thinking about strategies at this point.
Yeah, I think that is very wise. And what you were saying there, Sky, reminds me of that thing of, what the question that people ask, the voters often ask at elections about a specific candidate is A, are they like me? And B, do they like me? And, basically you have to win on one or both. And the most likable candidates win on both. And I heard the same criticism of Ron DeSantis, that a lot of people were thinking, actually, he doesn't quite win on either of them because he seems quite remote. He's not particularly charismatic. And he's certainly not got Trump's abilities to kind of raise people from the dead with his what's going on, capture attention in the same way. Ashley, any combination of those questions you want to pick up on?
I think I will take Maggie's specifically about the voter ID. And forgive me because I don't know if all my numbers still stand, but I want to say that there are voter ID laws in some form in 35 of our states. They vary from very strict ID to just mentioning it, whether it's a photo ID or some other form. It has been really noted, and I think that some of the states in the South, particularly Georgia, have seen this hardest. Just what it means to be able to have access to an ID. My grandmother, who raised me, was 100 years old when she passed away. She had never had a formal driver's license. So being able to come up with some of the documentation that is requested certainly can be prohibitive, but many times it is a matter of making sure that we continue the fight and putting that pressure to make sure that if the voter ID laws do go in effect, that there are provisions made so that people will be able to still vote. But it's certainly it certainly is harder. It makes it more difficult for particularly folks in the United States, whether they are people of color, older people, sometimes even college students, because there are times where college IDs are not an acceptable form of ID, even though somebody is a student at a university. And so really just, again, continuing that conversation and the pressure. I think I am going to yield, as Sky did, to Frank about Latino voters in Florida. However, I will say this all the time, being a Black woman, that Latinos are not a monolith. And so again, as we're watching what is unfolding across the country, I do think also some of this is not necessarily new. Oftentimes when we look at polls that have been released, we know that traditionally there are communities that have not been polled. And so again, we're looking at these numbers and they seem like something that is new, but it's not necessarily new. But I will say kind of the conversation that that has been happening amongst the Republican parties, that they have Latino voters on lock, is just not the case. I think we did see some unsettling stuff in Florida, but Florida is its own baby and beast, maybe. So I'm gonna turn that over. It is special. It is special. It is.
And this is definitely continuing that thread of don't let the media, the pollsters, that I'm beginning to sound something like populist here, like the political elite, but like, you know, determine the narrative.
You just rein them in.
Drain the. No, let's not even. Too soon. Way too soon.
Yeah, way too soon.
Frank, this has been a much hyped question, so I feel like you have to take it.
Yeah. So here's the thing. It's just demographically the Latino population and so I mean, we talk about the Latino population, and Ashley's absolutely right. It's very diverse based on national origin. And so in South Florida, you have the dominant population is Cuban Americans, then Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, upper class Colombians, right? All of whom have a deep-seated personal experience of left-wing governments that they fled. So for them, anything that sounds like socialism is a problem. And the Republicans have figured out that that's the key to a lot of hearts. But Puerto Ricans, who are the dominant Latino population in Ashley's backyard, they voted overwhelmingly for Democrats, right? And then Mexican Americans, who are the predominant populations in the Southwest, have been responsible for this huge shift. Arizona used to be bright red. New Mexico used to be bright red. Colorado used to be purplish red. California used to be purple. Guess what? They're all blue now because of Latinos and others who have, and Mexican American voters who are very family oriented and work oriented, and many are not so interested in politics, but they can tell who's with them and who's against them. And so all this talk about Republicans are winning over Latinos and they're going to blah, 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 and this historic shift, and they're going to be a multiracial working class party. What bullshit. They are a white nationalist party that will only accept people on their terms. So yeah, they have Black, Hispanic, and Asian folks who play that game, right? I mean, Herschel Walker is a perfect example of it, right? I mean, you know how many Black people in Georgia are planning to vote for Herschel Walker? You can fit them in on this Zoom. So people aren't stupid. So anyway, so the big victories coming out of Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona this week have been building for years and are driven by the diversifying electorate, primarily by Mexican American Latinos, Sky's people. So, right. So it's, so, Florida's special, and maybe Florida will know, maybe Florida will be, what California is to Democrats, that big state that is gone, is no longer a swing state. And in terms of just basics, let me just finish with this. The Democratic Party pulled out of Florida too long ago and basically said, we give up, rather than invest the way that, Ashley and Sky and others have done in other swing states. So there is a way back in, and it takes putting resources on the ground so that there's that's what the Republican Party did. So there is a way to build back. It could be a competitive state again, but it's going to have to take more than, a new message and a new candidate. It's going to have to be building from the base up in order to reconstitute a vibrant Democratic Party.
I think that's a fantastic point right there, Frank. I really wanted us to get in on this call, which is these, the oversight success takes years, and also these are conscious political choices about where to direct your resources, and we have the exact same issue here in the UK. In fact, our final round of questions is going to alight on just this issue, because it couldn't be a Compass podcast without someone mentioning electoral reform. Woo! Everybody drink. So we'll bring in the next round of questions. We've got Johnson. Hi, Johnson. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I think I'm unmuted. Yeah.
Yes, we got you.
Great conversation. I've actually been really transfixed with this midterms, but it kind of leads to the question I've got, which is the dynamics of managing a slim majority in the House. I've seen some reports basically suggesting it's very unusual to have the same collection of members at the beginning of the session and the end. And I've seen people talking about things like illness, death, age, etc. And they kind of cite this as a real problem in terms of there being a small majority. I just wanted to have any sort of comments on that.
Yeah, I think that was a great question. I hadn't even thought about that, but everything being on such a knife edge really does mean that, that things can go either way. Phil, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Good,
I teed you up quite well, I think.
Yeah. Yes, my question is, what changes to your electoral system would you like to see in order to improve it? Famously, with Hillary Clinton, she had a much better majority, but she still failed to win. So, famously, the popular vote doesn't necessarily win the presidency. So, what do you think?
We have only got 11 minutes left, but you can please just do the American voters style of just saying in all of the changes you want to make to the democratic system in the States. Barbara, finally, the final question goes to you.
Hello, yes. Mine is really about the whole thing of negative messaging, in a sense. Sky talked about rallying voters to vote against the Republican candidate, and we in the UK have got our Progressive Alliance is all about who can best beat a Tory candidate, and so setting that against the fact that negative messagings clearly didn't work very well with the Brexit referendum. My question is not about the Brexit referendum or the UK politics, but just about when does negative messaging work to spur the emotional sort of vote, and when does it not really?
I feel like this is just such a great question. And yeah, thank you, Barbara. I think this is pretty much relevant to every single podcast we ever have, is this question about negative versus positive messaging. Let's start with Sky, and then we'll go Frank and Ashley.
Well, I feel like I have to tackle the negative messaging one since I kind of put that out there earlier. As I was saying earlier, let me try to articulate it a little bit better. I think I don't see as much the way that we campaigned, in that we pointed out the distinction between the Republicans and the Democrats on the ballot this time, as much negative messaging as just showing that, being clear about what the choice really was. I think that the Republicans that we defeated, I'm talking about at the top of the ticket in some of these states where they were just election deniers, and some of those other places in House races or other state legislative districts where they actually had direct ties to the January 6th riot. We were presenting facts and saying, here's your choice on who these people are and the rhetoric that they use and what that means in terms of their values, and does that align with yours? So but to answer your question specifically more, Barbara, I don't think negative messaging works when you're talking about issue advocacy, when you're trying to convince people about an issue or a legislative proposition, because you do want people to understand and see how that policy or how that legislation can positively impact their everyday lives. So negative messaging is not as powerful on that front, I think, as positive messaging. And possibly, though I didn't follow it as closely, that could be part of the problem with Brexit, in that sense of negative messaging there. But I do think if you are going to negative messaging, unfortunately, to Michael Moore's point, it does work when you're talking about candidates, when you're talking specifically about individuals that you want to represent you or to run your government. So that's where I think the distinction could be.
I think that's a really fascinating distinction, actually, about how you also pass this thing between candidates and issues. And that is something we struggle with in the UK as well, definitely. Frank, which combination of questions do you want to pick up there?
Yeah, I'm sort of on the same thing, because I just think my favorite expression is an F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that says, the sign of intelligence is when you can hold two seemingly opposing ideas in your head at the same time and retain the ability to function. Look, you got to define your opponents and you got to propose solutions, right? So it's not either or, it's both and. And I think the Democrats have really found their stride on that. So you have Democrats saying, I'm willing to work with Republicans who are serious about solving the problems. And by the way, their candidates are so extreme. That's why they came up with this phrase, MAGA extremists, because they don't want to talk about all the deplorables the way Hillary did. They just want to talk about some ill-defined group of crazies over here. So that worked. I mean, it just did. And the press was deriding, oh, MAGA extremists, that'll never work. And boy, did it, because it resonated with people. So I just think that, and this is what Republicans did in this election. They didn't come up with any solutions. All they said is Joe Biden sucks, Democrats suck, they're a threat to America. And for even people who used to vote Republican, it was like, well, I care about inflation, but you're not going to do anything about inflation. All you're going to do is investigate Joe Biden and try to impeach him to please, King Donald. And so it's like, anyway, I just think it's really tricky, but it is the mastery that I think can defeat populism, and not just in America, is this idea of having a values-oriented set of solutions that are credible, that are well thought out, that are actionable, while defining the opposition as uninterested in solutions, as uninterested in and that's the majority versus minority aspect, rather than minority views being used to try to pummel the majority with their counter-majoritarian designs. I'll stop there.
That's great. And I just want to give a special shout out to John Fetterman on that exact point, because throughout the campaign, I just thought he was so light and funny in the way that he trolled his team, trolled them at odds, right? Like, that was just so great. And he picked up all the points, which are actually substantive as well. They weren't just personal. It's like, he just wants this for his own gain. He doesn't even live in the state, doesn't know anything about it. And then he also tacked back to talking about issues, to talking about trade unions and workers' rights and healthcare and abortion rights. Like, it was amazing how he waved those two together. And so, yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to that. Ashley, which of those questions you wanted to pick up?
I think I'm going to jump right on where Frank left off. I think it is absolutely, I love this whole both and. It is not either or, it is both and. When we're out there talking to voters, we are not necessarily talking to people all the time who go and show up to vote. So those that we know, again, we're trusting that they will do this thing. We are appreciative of them. We want them to be engaged. We want them to volunteer to show up. But we're talking to mid and low propensity voters, and we're trying to convince them that they have to turn out. One of the things that oftentimes we don't do a great job of talking about is what persuasion means when we talk about persuasion versus mobilization universe. Persuasion happens in every community across the country. The reality is persuasion looks slightly different based upon a certain demographic. But persuasion is necessary. For some people, it is persuading them to support our candidates. For some people, it is persuading them that they should take the time to show up and go vote. But no matter what, it requires both and. There has to be, obviously, for us to say, look, there's a difference between these candidates. And for us to say in a positive way, like, look, this is the candidate that we feel like best aligns with your values. This is why we're suggesting that you show up for them. So it is definitely both and. The other one was the question about election reform. I got real strong feelings about the Electoral College. The reality is, like, look, let's look back the inception of Electoral College, why it was meant. And sometimes it still feels like there's some of us that are counting as 3/5 of a person. This was not, again, if the majority of people vote for a candidate, I feel strongly that that candidate should be, whether it is the president, I feel like that should be the president. So just point blank. So that is my election reform. I think there are lots of things that we could talk about. I think in many of our states, again, I talked about or hinted at this at the beginning, there's states who have same-day voter registration. Why is it that someone has to wait 30 days, who's qualified, who's eligible to register to vote? I could go on and on about that, but I know we have limited time. So thank you.
One thing I want to say about I think Ashley's totally on. I agree with this. If I had more time, I would have talked about the electoral reform too. You just think about this, how paradoxical it is that Republicans who created the law in Georgia, for example, where if you don't get 51% of the vote, you have to go to a runoff, right? So they're saying in order to actually legitimately be elected, you have to get a majority vote. Yet for the presidency, they totally disregard the majority vote and say, no, it's down to just these electors that we've appointed in these states, and it isn't about the majority vote. So it's really just about whatever makes it easier for them to hold on to their power. And starting with the presidency would be the first place to start, where we actually make it reflect a majority vote in the country.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point.
And maybe we should be able to tabulate election results in one day instead of 2 months.
I mean, I don't want to say it's a little bit awkward. Like, even here in the UK, we have them on a piece of paper. Also, just I won't get into it now because we are nearing the end, but like the nerdiness of the wonkery of the machines and the punching, and I listened to a whole podcast on that, and it went down the rabbit hole, and I was like, guys, there's a pencil here and a piece of paper. I don't know. I know there's pros and cons, but like there's real questions about them machines.
We drool when we watch on the Beeb the English results being read out. We just
with our cup of tea and we're propelling everyone. Although I will say, actually, final point on that, it was a very sad moment that people were telling me that this happened around Brexit. So just to show you, we ain't so good over here in terms of people's faith in democracy. People who wanted to vote leave were sharing pens at the polling station because there was this big question of like, are they actually even going to let us vote for something and it was dark. Like I was like, that's bad. If people think that, because it's like because there's always pencils in the voting booth. But then I've always wondered why there were pencils because, you can't change your vote if you change your vote. Anyway, we're getting quite knee deep into the
we're familiar with conspiracy theories.
Well, yeah, I heard you had a bunch. Yeah, that's where I go for my conspiracy content. Is definitely the States. Not gonna lie. Brilliant. Thank you all so much. We're at 15:15. Thank you so much for staying this extra time. Thank you to everyone on your call for your amazing questions. I want to say mad love to all three of you because, we've been like Frank and Sky and I have worked together this bit over this past year. It's been really beautiful. And Ashley, it's been great to meet you and amazing to hear all the brilliant work you've done. And also a huge thank you to everybody around the globe who supports progressive causes, because what you guys are doing is, really making a huge difference to, frankly, all of our livable futures, let's be honest. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do tweet about it. Please do join Compass. We're a membership organisation, and because political organising is hard to fund, as we've heard tonight, even harder in the UK than it is in the US, believe it or not, we do really depend on membership support for all of the political thinking and campaigning and organising on the ground that we do. Our next podcast is on Tuesday the 22nd of November at 6 p.m. And actually, we'll be continuing this focus on the importance of on-the-ground work because we'll be in Cumbria, which is a really specific region for us, and they're focused on flipping seats to win the general election. We'll be hearing from activists and organisers on the ground about their efforts to combat fracking, build cross-party alliances, and grow the movement. We're going to have a special climate focus on this one as well because Cumbria is such a key area for renewables and anti-fracking, and we're going to hear from some amazing organisers we've been working with on the ground there to flip these seats. So finally, I want to say a huge thanks to Ashley, Frank, and Sky for all your time and energy tonight, and please don't be a stranger. Please stay in touch and let's continue the good fight / the onward peaceful march, or whatever we say that's not slightly militaristic. Thanks everyone, and
thank
good
you.
night. So that's where we will